Good afternoon or good morning to you on the West Coast. Welcome to the House Call. We're going to give it another minute for people to log in. We see the participants logging in now. We want to make sure that we give people a little bit of time for that. So I'll be back with you shortly. We're going to give it one more minute, maybe 30 seconds to give people a chance to log in, and then we'll get started. Thank you. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's House campaign call for universal, stable, affordable housing. I'm Paul Keeley, the sort of outgoing Chief Operating Officer at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. I'll mention more about that in just a second. But I want to welcome you to today's call. We've got a great array of speakers and panelists to present to you and to answer your questions. And we'll get right to who's going to be part of today's call. So we're going to have members of the NLIC policy team provide a Capitol Hill update on what's going on in Congress these days on two new important bills, the Stable Families Act and the Rent Relief Act, the FY23 spending bill, the reconciliation package, and the August recess and what all that means for affordable housing advocates. Kate Leifheit from UCLA and Gabe Schwartz from UC San Francisco will share new research on building health equity through housing policy. We'll also be joined by Deborah Throop and Tanaya Srini with the National Housing Law Project to discuss the results of NHLP's HUD Eviction Survey. We'll also hear from NLIC's End Rental Arrears to Stop Evictions project team about new Treasury guidance on ERA spending. We'll receive an update from the field from Vermont and more. So I do want to remind everybody that if you have questions, we will try our best to answer as many questions as we can live. And hopefully our panelists will also be able to stay on for a little while to answer questions via the chat that we don't have an opportunity to answer live. Before we jump right in, let me just mention something that I alluded to right at the very beginning. I've been the Chief Operating Officer at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition for 8 years now. And on Friday of this week, I will be retiring. And so I want to, this will be my last time emceeing this call. And I want to share with everybody that we have a new Chief Operating Officer at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, Kendra Johnson, who's fantastic. She's been with us now for a week. She and I are having a little bit of time to overlap. She comes to NLIC with an extensive background in accounting and executive management. Prior to joining NLIC, she served as Vice President of Finance and Administration at Money One Federal Credit Union, and she has nonprofit accounting and management experience at Prince George's Workforce Services Corporation and the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. She has an undergraduate degree in accounting, and she has an MBA and a master's degree in management with a specialization in nonprofit and association management. So you'll be hearing from her, you'll be seeing her name, and it's a real pleasure to be working with her now. She's, as I said, fantastic. A great addition to the NLIC team. It's been my absolute honor and pleasure I feel so fortunate to have worked on this great mission at NLIHC, and will continue to be an advocate for social and housing justice going forward. So that's just a quick note about some changes at the coalition. And so now what we're going to do is just jump right into Capitol Hill updates. And I will turn it over to our Senior Vice President for Public Policy and Field Organizing, Sarah Sadian. Sarah, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Before, I'm actually going to turn it over to both Kim Johnson and Elena Calabro, who are going to give an update about 2 bills that have been introduced. And of course, I would be remiss to not share with everybody just how much we at the coalition are going to miss Paul as he heads into retirement. Thanks so much for all of your work, and I'm going to miss all of the dad jokes in the office. Kim and Elena, do you want to join on?
Yeah, thanks so much, Sarah. And just to, echo what Sarah said, thank you, Paul, for being such a wonderful colleague and COO for our organization. It's been a real treat, working with you these last 3 years, and we're definitely going to miss you, as excited as we are to welcome Kendra. Anyway, thank you all today for joining us. I'm Kim Johnson. I'm a senior policy analyst with the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and I'm here today to talk about the Stable Families Act and Eviction Crisis Act. So the bipartisan Eviction Crisis Act, which was introduced in the Senate by Senators Michael Bennet and Rob Portman, and the Stable Families Act, introduced recently in the House by Representative Richie Torres, who was actually on just a few weeks ago talking about the bill, would provide an innovative approach to increasing housing stability by creating a new permanent emergency rental assistance fund that would help stabilize households experiencing an economic shock before it causes instability and homelessness. Most families in poverty who rent spend at least half of their incomes on housing, leaving virtually no margin for an unexpected expense. As a result, broken down cars, unreimbursed medical bills, or a sudden drop in income can quickly send vulnerable households down a spiral of housing instability, eviction, and in worst cases, homelessness, all of which often require more prolonged, extensive, and expensive assistance, not to mention, of course, the trauma that comes along with facing eviction and homelessness. The pandemic has really laid bare the inadequacies of our social safety net, but the eviction crisis in this country was brewing long before the pandemic hit. Before the pandemic, households faced eviction for, on average, as little as $600 in back rent, with some households owing as little as $120 in back rent. Black women, and particularly Black mothers, are disproportionately impacted by this crisis and have been before the pandemic as well. Evictions harm families and communities, risking lives and pushing people deeper into poverty. Evictions are linked to numerous poor physical and mental health outcomes, make it more difficult for people to rent safe and decent housing in the future, and have wide-reaching ramifications for people's ability to apply for credit, borrow money, or purchase a home. The instability and trauma caused by eviction is particularly harmful for children, who suffer in ways that can also impact their educational development and well-being for the rest of their lives. Recognizing the necessity of keeping people in their homes during the pandemic, Congress allocated over $46 billion in emergency rental assistance for households at risk of eviction. These funds have been crucial to ensuring households most vulnerable to eviction are able to remain in their homes and have broad positive impacts on recipients' mental health and financial well-being. However, these vital funds are running out, even as people continue to struggle to afford rent during the ongoing pandemic, not to mention the increase in the cost of rent that we've seen across the board, particularly this year. We need a permanent emergency rental assistance program like the one proposed in the Eviction Crisis Act or Stable Families Act to build on the infrastructure and best practices that we've learned and created throughout the pandemic, and to ensure that no household that falls behind on rent must face the trauma of eviction. So you can learn more about the Eviction Crisis Act and the Stable Families Act at this link. I actually can't send a message to the whole chat, so I'll figure out how to do that. And I'll also send along a sign-on letter that we are hosting for organizations to join in order to urge Congress to bring the Eviction Crisis Act and Stable Families Act to the floor for a vote. So I will turn it over now to Elena and figure out how to post things in the chat.
Hi everyone, Kim, I'm having the same issue. I'm not sure what's going on with that, but we will figure that out so we can send everybody these links. So I'm just here to provide an update on the Rent Relief Act, which was a bill that was reintroduced last week by Representatives Danny Davis, Jimmy Gomez, Scott Peters, and Jimmy Panetta. The bill would help bridge the widening gap between incomes and housing costs by providing a refundable tax credit to millions of housing cost burdened renters. We have a fact sheet that I can post in the chat once I figure that out. So the Rent Relief Act would help close the gap for millions of households that are eligible for vouchers, but cannot access them due to inadequate funding by Congress. The bill would build on the success of the Advanced Child Tax Credit to provide monthly support to renters earning less than $100,000, who spend at least 30% of their adjusted gross income on rent and utilities. The credit would cover a share of the difference between 30% of income and rent, capped at 100% of small area fair market rent. And for the lowest income renters earning less than $25,000 annually, the credit would cover the entire difference between 30% of income and rent. And then the credit would phase out between for households making between 25 and 100, covering 75% of that 30% income to rent gap for households earning 25 to 50,000, 50% of the gap for households earning between 50 and 75,000, and then 25% of the gap for households earning between 75 and 100,000. And the renter's tax credit also overcomes many of those administrative barriers that often prevent voucher holders from accessing housing, because it would provide relief directly to the renter, minimizing landlord involvement. And we really see this bill as a way to get to universal housing assistance, but through the tax code. And as all of you know, we need lots of resources to make housing affordable for the lowest income renters. So we see a renter's tax credit like the one proposed in the Rent Relief Act as part of a comprehensive strategy that would also go alongside significant investments in housing supply. So there's not a companion bill in the Senate at this time, but we are encouraging advocates to ask your representatives to endorse the Rent Relief Act. Again, I will put some information in the chat, and I'm also happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you for that, Elena and Kim. I'll give an update about where things are with budget reconciliation, appropriations, and some other issues, and then we can open it up for Q&A from the audience. So in terms of reconciliation, last week, Senator Manchin announced that he would not support any of the climate change / energy provisions in a reconciliation bill, meaning that the only items that Democrats seem to be able to agree on are reducing the price of prescription drugs and extending healthcare subsidies for another 2 years. This is yet another major blow to the president's domestic policy agenda. And there's another example of how Senator Manchin has really drastically scaled back what would be included in the package. But it seems like at this point, Democrats really don't have any other option but to accept what Senator Manchin has proposed and to try to pass it as quickly as possible. We hear that next steps will be for the Senate to try to move this bill through their process. That means turning it into legislative text and going through a couple of different procedural hoops. This week, one of those hoops is meeting with both the parliamentarian and Republicans for what's called a bird bath, which is when you review every provision to make sure it complies with the bird rule around how reconciliation, what can be included. That's likely to happen this week. And they're likely to try to move this forward by either the end of the month, maybe the first week of August, to try to get it through Congress. We know that the time frame may slip just a little bit, but it does seem like everybody is trying to work as quickly as possible. I also should just say we're continuing to push for housing resources to be included in a reconciliation package. Many of you guys know we've been really loud about the need for rental assistance, public housing funds, and funds for the National Housing Trust Fund. We're going to continue to lift up those needs until we see a bill that's been introduced and it is passed and there isn't an opportunity to move forward. But I will say that it seems more and more challenging to imagine that the bill is going to include housing resources in it, which is really disappointing. I will say that when it comes to appropriations, that is a place where we are hoping to see increased housing resources. The House is voting this week on their draft spending bill for fiscal year 23. You may remember that the House bill included a really significant increase in funding for HUD programs, about 17% compared to last year, and even $1 billion more than what was in the president's budget request. So really robust funding levels in that bill. Most programs saw at least modest increases in funding, if not pretty significant increases. And I know that we're paying very close attention to the House bill's proposal to expand housing vouchers to an additional 140,000 families or households. The Rules Committee is meeting today to figure out which amendments will be voted on the House floor. Of course, several hundred amendments have been offered, but not all of them will receive a vote. So we're going to be checking in with the Rules Committee to see if any amendments might be offered that would be harmful for housing programs. If we learn of any particularly harmful amendments that need action, we will send out an alert to let everyone know to contact their members of Congress. But my guess is that given the divide in Congress between Republicans and Democrats, I don't think that any of the harmful amendments are likely to pass right now. I will also say that the House bill numbers are much higher than where we think they will ultimately end up. That's because Democrats are moving forward with a Democratic-only bill in the House, and we know that at some point, Democrats are going to have to negotiate with Senate Republicans on a bill that can get their support as well. And so we might see funding levels go down from there. We also know that the Senate Democrats are growing frustrated at their inability to reach an agreement with Senate Republicans on top line spending numbers. So we may see a similar process happen in the Senate where the Democrats move forward their bill and that they leave negotiations and particular funding levels until later in the year so that they can try to work out an arrangement with Republicans. So we don't expect a final spending bill until maybe November, December. And until then, we'll likely see Congress pass sometime in September a continuing resolution to keep the government open and give them more time for negotiations. Okay, next I want to spend a little bit of time talking about August recess. If we can go to the next slide. So unless the Senate, the schedule changes in order for Congress to move the reconciliation bill through their process, we will likely see senators and representatives go back to their home states and districts for several weeks during August and September. So you can see here the House is scheduled as of right now to be out from July 29th to September 12th. The Senate will be out from August 5th to September 5th. This is a really important time for advocates to be meeting with their members of Congress while they are home and to talk with them about the housing and homelessness crisis, about the House campaign, about those long-term housing solutions that we're all pushing for. This year, August recess is happening at a particularly important time. Many communities are seeing that the emergency funds that were passed by Congress during the pandemic, like the emergency rental assistance funds, those are starting to run out, and renters are seeing soaring inflation, rising rental costs, increased evictions, and in many places increased homelessness. And at the same time, where those resources are dwindling, we're also seeing dangerous anti-homeless rhetoric and measures at the state and local level that are gaining traction. And those are efforts that would criminalize homelessness, impose punitive requirements in order to access shelter or housing, and even prevent the development of affordable housing altogether. You may have seen that the Missouri governor just signed into law a really harmful bill that would do all of those things that I just mentioned. And so it's really important that advocates are speaking with one voice to push back against those efforts and to lift up the long-term solutions, those included that are embraced by the House campaign, for example, like expanding rental assistance to everybody who's eligible, building more homes that are affordable to people with the lowest incomes, creating permanent programs to provide emergency rental assistance, like my colleague Kim mentioned, and enacting and enforcing renter protections. And so we would love to encourage you to think about how you can use the August recess coming up to educate your senators and representatives. And one way you can do that is by scheduling a meeting with them in person while they're back home. You can invite them to take a tour of a Housing First program or an affordable housing development, especially if they used National Housing Trust Fund dollars to help build it. You can help shape the narrative in the media by lifting up key messages on social media. And you can start to collect and share stories from people with lived experience and share that with your members of Congress and with the public. And I think all of those things are really needed to help push back against these harmful efforts we're seeing across the country. Next slide. I just want to let you guys know that NLHC is going to be publishing an advocacy toolkit that will include talking points, sample messages, tips on how to schedule those meetings with your members of Congress, or how to have tours that are really successful with your members of Congress. We're hoping to publish that this week so that you guys can start thinking about how you're going to use August recess. There are a couple of places where we think are most important to spend our time this August. The first one, unsurprisingly, is to talk about resources that are in the FY23 spending bill. I mentioned earlier that the House is moving forward with really robust funding levels, and that we also don't think that those are going to be the final numbers in a spending bill. We want to make sure we're keeping the pressure on senators and representatives to fund housing programs at the highest level possible. So that's going to be a key place for you guys to engage during August recess. Next slide. We also would encourage you to focus on some really immediate and urgent threats that we're seeing, those anti-homelessness efforts that I mentioned earlier. This is a good time for you to be educating your members of Congress about why is Housing First so successful? What does it look like in your community? And why we need long-term solutions like universal housing vouchers and more housing for people who are, that's affordable to people with the lowest incomes. Next slide. And then, of course, we would love to help use this time in Congress, or use this time during the August recess, to build congressional support for what we see as being some of the most critical bills that address long-term housing solutions. You may know that we have 4 areas that we focus on in the House campaign. The first one is about bridging the gap between incomes and housing costs. And I've included, for example, 2 bills where we could really use some help building co-sponsors for. The first one is a bipartisan bill that pairs 500,000 vouchers with mobility counseling so that families with young children can move to communities of their choice. The second one is a much larger, more expansive bill, the Ending Homelessness Act from Chairwoman Waters, that would create a universal housing rental assistance program, and it would ban source of income discrimination. Next slide, please. The second pillar of the House campaign that we're going to be focusing on for this August recess is about expanding and preserving the housing supply that's affordable to people with the lowest incomes. And for that, we want to draw a lot of attention to the American Housing and Economic Mobility Act from Senator Warren. It's a robust bill. It has lots of different elements to it, but the core of the bill is a $45 billion annual appropriation for the National Housing Trust Fund, among other elements. It's really what at the scale that's needed to build affordable housing. Next slide. The third pillar of our campaign is about stabilizing families to help prevent evictions. And for that, I'm going to call back to the Eviction Crisis Act and the Stable Families Act that my colleague Kim mentioned earlier. We would love your help to build bipartisan support for this bill that would create a permanent program to provide emergency rental assistance to households in crisis. We've seen how successful this works during the pandemic, and we want to build on that infrastructure and keep it going for the long run. And then finally, next slide, please. We're going to focus our August recess on building support for strengthening and enforcing renter protections. The bill that we see at the federal level that would do this is the Fair Housing Improvement Act from Senator Kaine and Representative Peters. This would ban discrimination based on source of income and military status and veteran status. We think it's a bill that could garner bipartisan support, but at the very least, we want to see every Democrat on this bill. And we hope we can use the August recess to really build up congressional support. So with that, I am going to turn it back to Paul to see if there are any questions from folks on the line about the huge update. There's a lot of information here about all of the various things that are going on Capitol Hill, as well as ways to use the August recess to educate members of Congress.
Outstanding. Thank you very much, Sarah, Kim, Elena. Great presentation, tremendous information, I think, for all of our participants today. There were a few questions, some of which I think we tried to answer in the chat, but I think it'd be good to just maybe say a word or two about each. I think it was Gina Wilt who asked if the Stable Families Act and the Eviction Crisis Act are different. Are there key areas that you might be able to identify how they're different? Maybe Kim?
Yeah, I can jump in for that. The Eviction Crisis Act is the bipartisan bill from Senators Bennett and Portman. It includes a number of provisions. For example, it would create a evictions database. It would fund mediation courts. There's a lot of great provisions in it, but we're most focused on one provision that would create that permanent emergency rental assistance resource for communities. On the House side, the Stable Families Act only includes that permanent emergency rental assistance program. It doesn't include, for example, the eviction database. So that's why, unfortunately, they have slightly different names, but we want to build congressional support for both.
Another question we had, and this might be for Elena, is in the Rent Relief Act, the renter's tax credit, would this be for people in subsidized housing and people with vouchers?
So sorry. Hi. So the credit would not, so the renter's tax credit is trying to bring everybody up to that level of 30%, not paying more than 30% of income on rent. So there's no additional credit in the Rent Relief Act for people living in federally assisted housing. However, there are lots of renters who are living in USDA and LIHTC properties who already pay more than 30% of their income on rent. And so this would certainly help them be able to reach that level and better afford their rent.
Great, thank you, Elena. So a couple of questions that Jerry asked is, and one I definitely know the answer to, is there a Senate analog to Congresswoman Maxine Waters' Ending Homelessness Act, Sarah?
There is not right now, but we are working on that.
And then Jerry also wondered if we could share the Missouri Anti-Homelessness People Bill, maybe a link to that in the chat or something.
Yeah, I can definitely do that. We've talked about, I think we've talked about this on previous calls too. That bill is really based off of model legislation from a conservative think tank who has been shopping it around to various locations. We have seen it at least in 10 states or so, but I hear that as many as 65 states may have, or states and communities may have, bills that focus on criminalizing homelessness. So it's definitely something that we're starting to see creep up nationwide, and we're very concerned about. So we can share a link to that maybe in our follow-up email to everybody who's on the call.
Great. Again, thank you, Kim, Elena, and Sarah, for this really valuable information. And we just really want to encourage everybody to get involved with their members of Congress during the August recess. So thank you very much. We
Great.
will now move on to our next, see you, Sarah. We'll move on to the next portion of our agenda. And it's my pleasure to introduce Kate Leifheit, and who's from UCLA, and Gabe Schwartz, who's from UC San Francisco. We're going to be talking about building health equity through housing policy. So I will turn it over to both Kate and Gabe now. Are you there?
Thank you so much,
Oh,
Paul.
there you go. Great.
Hello.
All right. Great. Looks like we can control our slides. So my name is Kate Leifheit, and I'm co-presenting with my friend and collaborator, Gabe Schwartz. And we are both researchers that work in the space of housing and housing policies and how they impact health outcomes. So what we're presenting on today is a paper that we recently published called Building Health Equity Through Housing Policies, Critical Reflections and Future Directions for Research. Wanted to start off by acknowledging our co-authors and collaborators in this work, Drs. Craig Pollock and Sabria Linton, both at Johns Hopkins. And just to give everyone a flavor for the paper, this was published in the Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health. I wanted to let everyone know that it's an open access paper, so we can put the link in the chat and you can read it in full if you're interested. The first 3 points that we make in the paper are ones that are going to be really, really familiar to this audience. So we say that housing is fundamental to health, and yet housing insecurity is exceedingly common in the US. And we write that housing insecurity is not inevitable, but results from clear and often inequitable policy choices. Because those three are sort of the bread and butter of you all at LIHC. We didn't want to focus on those. Instead, we're spending some time on number 4, which is we ask, what role can health researchers play in changing the status quo? So what can we do as researchers to help support policies that build health equity? So today we're going to discuss those research recommendations, spend about 10 minutes on it, and then we wanted to dedicate some time to asking, what do you think? So we love feedback on these recommendations. We'd like to know how, from your perspective, we can make research more helpful to kind of the policy and advocacy communities. So there's dedicated time at the end, but as we're going through our recommendations, feel free to hop in the chat and give us feedback in real time. With that, I'll turn it over to Gabe to start the recommendations.
Thanks, Kate. So our first major point is sort of twofold. One of them is that for any researchers on the call and also researchers you might be talking to, I think there's this feeling that if you're going to be taken seriously as an objective scientist, you can't be an advocate. And we'd like to sort of flip that and say, well, if we take ourselves seriously as scientists and believe what we're publishing about the negative impacts of housing insecurity, eviction, homelessness on health, it's actually our sort of professional job to then provide testimony, be on the front lines of asking policymakers to take that research seriously as well. And to do that well, I think there's sort of short-term and long-term ways researchers can be orienting themselves to this. One is by being on calls like this and having real relationships with tenant advocacy organizations and housing justice movements to learn, say, okay, we know there's an eviction moratorium fight coming up in the next year where we're going to need to push that forward. What can we do in the short term to really generate evidence that can help advocates make the best case possible? So for instance, this year, we published some work on the health impacts of eviction moratoriums that it's useful because people actually want research on that topic. It's not like an esoteric academic debate. And in the longer term, saying, okay, what bodies of evidence do we need to build for advocates to really make their best case to policymakers and build movements with effective messages? And the flip side of that is, so the best way to do this is to have people with lived experience be leading that research. So as an example, the Healthy Neighborhood Study in Eastern Massachusetts started as builders needing an evaluator to say, we're building these healthy buildings that have lower emissions, have healthier materials, and we want a health assessment. And the researchers said, well, okay, but also the health of the people in the neighborhoods where these new buildings are being built and potentially being gentrified matters too. And so they partnered with community organizations to hire community members to be able to say, okay, what questions do we think we want answered? How do we want to collect that research? And let's ourselves get paid to do it. And then these are the theories we want to test about how housing impacts our health. And then the researchers are really there for technical support and fitting these models and sort of doing what the community researchers want done. And then that research has been really helpful both for tenants to be able to say, when they're doing advocacy and trying to recruit people to do tenant organizing, say this isn't just happening to you, here's research we collected about what's happening to our community. And it's also helpful to go to funders and say, well, this is what the community and researchers together have put together. And it's really shaped how those funders are spending money on affordable housing.
So sort of related to changing the way we do research, we also recommend that researchers ask consequentialist questions and use expanded frameworks. So the first half of that really just means ask questions that matter and ask questions that have the potential to meaningfully change the social, economic, and policy landscapes that people live in. So I've given an example here. So a really common research question that we might ask is, to what degree is housing insecurity associated with mental distress? And what we recommend is that as much as possible, researchers sort of shift the frame and ask about specific policies and programs. So instead of that, try asking, how does getting off the Section 8 wait list affect mental distress? And you can see how just changing the question that we're asking then leads to research that has immediate policy implications and is sort of easier to translate into policies and programs with ability to affect people's lives in the short term for the better. We also suggest that researchers frame housing insecurity as a result of policy choices. So another thing that you see pretty commonly in public health literature is something like neighborhood deprivation is associated with poor health. What we recommend is instead to say XYZ policies that deprive neighborhoods of resources are associated with poor health. And you can see that by shifting the way that we discuss this phenomenon, we're then pointing sort of the finger of blame at the policies, the people who made that policies, and the power dynamics that give rise to deprivation, instead of sort of blaming the neighborhood itself for poor conditions. And then the last point that we make on this recommendation is that we should be studying residential instability across a range of severity. So we know that there's a lot of research on homelessness, and rightly so. It's a huge problem in the US, but we study homelessness, unsheltered homelessness in particular, and its consequences for health quite a bit. But everyone on this call knows that homelessness is sort of the tip of the iceberg and is a symptom of unaffordable housing. So what we recommend to health researchers is to sort of bear this in mind and study this full range of residential instability, starting with sort of living in unaffordable housing all the way to unsheltered homelessness.
The corollary to that, which I think is not as well sort of understood in more advocacy spaces, is that the data infrastructure here is really bad. That all of these studies that have followed families' health for years and years and really get a sense of what happens to people long-term when something bad happens to them, almost none of those data sets have basically any detailed information about housing. We're like lucky if they have a renting versus owned housing question. Sometimes we get one eviction question, but we know that there's a lot of different types of evictions. There's a lot of different types of unaffordable housing. There's a lot of different types of economic support they could be receiving from the government. There's sheltered homelessness, unsheltered homelessness. And there's been very little like literal monetary investment and investment in time in collecting information on people's detailed housing histories and really what their housing situation was and continues to be, along with health information. And so that has to be both a shift in priorities of places like the NIH or foundations that I think really don't appreciate that there's like very little data on this at big scale, and has to shift on the part of researchers to say we really need to spend time trying to convince these funders to put in data that can really help science and advocacy over the next 10, 20, 30 years.
Our fourth recommendation was that we need to be testing for policy impacts on health inequity. And that's because even a race or class neutral policy tends to have unequal impacts when we live in a very unequal society. So as an example, lead paint was banned nationally in 1978. And that policy action was population level and in theory should have done away with lead poisoning across the board for everyone, right? But we know that isn't the case. Because lead exposure prevention requires that tenants have either the power to advocate for remediation or the money and housing options to move out if necessary, low income, children of color continue to be poisoned by lead. So these power dynamics that exist at the population level get replicated when we look at policy impacts. And therefore, when we're studying the impact of a policy, we need to look within different groups, and we need to focus on groups that are structurally vulnerable for poor outcomes, and make sure that we're not losing them when we look at kind of the aggregate overall policy impact.
And once we've done all that research, I think there also tends to be a tendency for researchers to say, well, I published it in this high impact journal. Great, like someone will read it and decide to change their policies as a result. And we know that's not true, right? Policymaking is not just about data, it's also about like governance and power. And so I think partnering with community organizations is something we really recommend researchers do, that have explicit communication about how is it best for us to present this data to you? Like, do you want a policy brief? Do you want us to come talk to you? Do you want us to tell you if there's research in this area that you're really looking for research about, and we can be a resource for you, just connecting you to that information? At the most basic level, you need to be able to read it. So setting aside money in our grants and getting universities to fund open access science, and also to make things a bit more easily interpretable. So not just an odds ratio, but like, okay, how many people health was impacted by this policy? And then include clear calls to action, right? We heard at the beginning of this call, there are all these actual real bills today that could increase people's health. And so instead of ending papers with, we really think we should focus on housing to improve health, say, here are the 10 bills that are up right now that need to be passed, or some iteration of them need to be passed to push forward improving population health with housing.
So those were our recommendations to researchers. But of course, we sort of live in this world. And so we thought it would be great to bring it to you all who are advocates, organizers, and policymakers, and ask you how we in the research community can form stronger partnerships with you, improve our communication, and better align our research priorities with your objectives. So if you're willing to type your suggestions in the chat, we thought we could compile them and share them on Twitter as sort of an addendum to our paper. So yeah, we can leave those prompts up or put them in the chat, whatever works best.
All right, fantastic. Is there also, let me just see, is there a way that maybe afterwards, after they've let this percolate a little bit, they could shoot you guys an email or something along those lines?
Right, so our emails are here. We can also put them in the chat, emails and Twitter handles.
Fantastic, that's perfect. Okay, great. Just one question here. Jerry had a couple, and one is multi-part. I don't know if maybe it is a kind of a follow-up kind of thing, but if you have any quick thoughts that you'd like to share, this multi-part question that Jerry had early on, how might we frame this discussion in meetings of city and county boards of supervisors who could challenge staff to explore and present responses to your equity health impacts? Are there best practice localities that could help ratchet up a better public health model? Is there a virtual community of practice information?
Well, two things that come to mind is that cities often, I live in Oakland, and when these sort of fights have come up, the local government has often said, well, we don't even know how many people that affects. But it's like, oh, well, you could. And so there are municipal governments, like, I mean, the city of New York obviously has a much more money than most places do, but it has public eviction records that are available to researchers, trying to figure out a way to balance tenants' rights to not have sort of their eviction records easily looked up in the public sphere and available for research to say, in a protected environment, well, we know this many people are, say, getting evicted or experiencing unsheltered homelessness which is really the only place from the point of time count we have data. And this is what we think that means for your county's health. Trying to push for just very basic descriptive statistics at the local level, I think could go a long way to then advocating at that level. Kate, do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't have any immediate thoughts. I know there is an organization called City Health that is ranking cities right now in terms of the strength of protections that they offer to tenants. And the interesting thing about that organization is they're sort of health facing. So they're the idea is to sort of get these policies in the eyes of people working in health departments and say, look, your city is getting a bronze in terms of how it's serving people, people's housing needs. So that's one thought. It's not exactly what Jerry's talking about, because I don't think it's necessarily a place for crosstalk between cities that are doing this well and doing it badly, but at least it sort of is an effort to provide some information about how different cities are doing with respect to their housing policies and health.
Great, thank you very much. So there are some suggestions, some additional questions coming in. If you guys do have time to respond to some of those, I do want to be cognizant of the other speakers that we have on our call today and not delay too much. So if you could engage with folks via the chat, that would be really helpful. And I think you're getting lots of good responses to what you're asking about.
Well, thank you, everyone.
Right.
It was really nice to be here and hear from you all.
Thank you so much,
Thanks so much
Kate
for the
and Dave.
invitation.
Really appreciate it. Outstanding job. Thank you. So important. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the next part of our call today. And that is with some partners from the National Housing Law Project, with which the coalition works very closely frequently. And we have Deborah Throop and Tanaya Srini, who are going to talk a little bit about their HUD Eviction Survey results. So Deborah and Tanaya, are you there?
We are here. Thank you so much, Paul.
Sure.
And thanks so much for inviting us today to talk about the results of a recent survey that we did. So first, my name is Deborah Throop. I'm the Deputy Director of the National Housing Law Project. As Paul said, we work really closely with the coalition on a number of issues. We focus on the preservation of affordable housing and tenants' rights. We also have a field network of about 2,000, mostly legal services attorneys, but also other housing advocates working in the field directly representing tenants. And a lot of our policy advocacy is informed by our network. So before I get started, I'm just going to thank my colleagues. You're going to hear from Tanaya Srini, our research director, and also want to thank Marie Claire Tran Leung, who's the lead. She's the director of our Evictions initiative, and then also Dee Swesnick, who is our communications director. The survey was a team effort. So I'm going to provide some background and then pass it over to Tanaya, who's going to focus on the research results. So first, this is the third survey that we've done around evictions, and we started doing these during the pandemic. And we did them in part because we really wanted to get a sense for what was happening on the ground. As many of you know, there's not a lot of eviction data out there, let alone real-time eviction data. And so we were hearing a lot from our network, who again consists mostly of people directly representing tenants in evictions action and other housing cases. And so we started doing these surveys. Our first one was in July 2020. We did another one in fall 2021. And they were really broadly focused on sort of the state of evictions, particularly, you know, in light of the eviction moratoriums that were popping up across the country and some of the national, the federal protections. So in rolling out these other surveys, one thing that kept coming up was that, you know, even HUD itself was asking us, do you have specific data on our housing programs? What is happening with evictions related to, for example, public housing and vouchers, which is what our survey results ended up focusing on. Because interestingly, HUD doesn't even collect its own data, eviction data for its own programs. And so we really wanted to understand what was happening. You know, and as we started to collect data, another interesting thing that was happening at the same time, we were hearing from a lot of people from our network that housing authorities and other federally assisted owners were starting to evict people again, basically ramping up their efforts to evict tenants, particularly for non-payment of rent. And this was coinciding with the end of many local moratoriums, and as ERAP, the emergency rental assistance, was drying up nationwide. So again, we decided to collect the data to get a broader perspective on the problem. So with that, I'm going to pass it. Next slide, please, to Tanai, who's going to go over the survey results.
Thanks, Deb. Okay, so yeah, just to reiterate, we'll go through the evictions in public housing, evictions in voucher housing, emergency rental assistance that covers both of those portfolios, and then just a bit on the CARES Act. We did collect data on multifamily housing as well, but just for the purposes of this presentation, we have omitted that. If you have questions about that data, we're happy to share. And just as a note, we had 148 respondents from 41 states, DC and Puerto Rico. All the states but the ones listed were represented. And if you know tenant advocates from those states, let us know. And about 78% of caseloads included evictions from public housing tenants, and 90% of caseloads included evictions of voucher tenants. So we feel like we had a good cross-section of folks to get this data from. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so first on evictions in public housing. So just shy of 75% of respondents reported eviction defense cases had increased or returned to pre-pandemic levels. In particular, almost half responded that non-payment of rent cases were increasing for PHA tenants in their areas, and 35% reported an increase in illegal evictions for public housing tenants. We also asked for our Housing Justice Network to provide relevant anecdotes and expand on their answers. And an interesting trend that we saw was that public housing authorities were not making it possible for tenants to file documents digitally. These are documents related to hardship declarations, income recertifications, and then their in-person document management processes during the pandemic resulted in a lot of data loss and document loss. And PHAs often claimed never to have received these documents for various purposes, including those income recertifications that are super crucial because, you know, they had lock boxes or something like that. So that is a trend that we wanted to highlight because it, you know, is very avoidable. Next slide. We also asked about strategies to reduce rent. So many of you know that we did a waiver analysis a couple of years ago at the start of the pandemic to understand how public housing authorities were implementing the available flexibilities from HUD. That analysis only covered California. So this was our attempt to understand the national trends. And what we found is that many public housing authorities ignored these strategies altogether. So 72% of our respondents reported that PHAs in their area did not recertify tenants' rent so that it reflected real-time changes in income. 81% reported that PHAs didn't implement a $0 minimum rent policy, even when families saw drastic reductions in income. And 61% reported that PHAs didn't offer tenant repayment plans for past due rent prior to evicting them. These were all waivers that were available to be implemented. And while some PHAs took advantage of these waivers, because HUD didn't make them mandatory, many tenants suffered. So I will pass it back to Deb to talk about some of our recommendations.
Thanks. Perfect. So I want to say one more thing about the waivers, just that HUD did publish its own waiver data recently. And so their data actually supports what we found. You know, about, I would say according to their data, a little less than half of housing authority accessed waivers that were available during the pandemic. That statistic is a little deceiving because it was most of the larger housing authorities. So a higher number of tenants were able, you know, we're living in programs administered by housing authorities that access a lot of the waivers, but nonetheless, this was a national survey. And so, you know, we had people from our network all over the country. And so, you know, a lot of tenants were living in housing authorities that didn't access those waivers. So we've made a number of recommendations based on our survey results. You know, as Tanai pointed out, HUD you know, took some steps, for example, by allowing the waivers during the pandemic to protect its residents during the pandemic. So another thing they did, for example, was publish an eviction prevention and housing stability toolkit that had a lot of great resources for housing authorities and owners to, again, prevent evictions, particularly for non-payment of rent, especially when it's related to hardship. But what we saw, and that was consistent with our survey results, is really inconsistent application of those policies because they were all left to the discretion of individual housing authorities. So a lot of our recommendations are focused on requiring HUD owners, housing authorities, and landlords to do more, and do more, particularly for people facing financial hardship. So we've rolled out a few resources. Those of you that do work directly with tenants, we have with this survey, we rolled out a handful of resources. One is, and I'll put the links in the chat, and I believe they should be on the slides as well. But the first resource is focused on eviction prevention, specifically for HUD tenants, and it's really provides some great tools to protect tenants from eviction, particularly in the public housing and voucher programs. So I will put that in the chat. It has some some innovative ways to help tenants. For example, helping tenants file for bankruptcies, for example, may preserve somebody's tenancy if they're facing an eviction for non-payment. So I'll put the link to the chat while I pass it back to Tanaya. I'll put the link for the survey. I'm not sure if the survey link is here either. So I'll put the survey link and then also this resource link in the chat and pass it back to you, Tanaya.
Thanks. Okay, so next we'll talk about evictions in voucher housing. And this is where we saw some of the most staggering numbers. So 92% of respondents reported that voucher tenant evictions had either increased or returned to pre-pandemic levels. And unpacking the statistic, over half of respondents reported increases. So something like 53% said that these voucher tenants were being evicted at a higher rate than before. 66% of our respondents reported an increase in evictions due to unreasonable rent. So that was the main driver that we saw in our survey results. 69% of respondents reported an increase in voucher eviction cases for non-payment of rent compared to pre-pandemic levels. Additionally, 80% of respondents saw an increase or return in levels of illegal lockout cases for voucher tenants, and 80% saw an increase or return in levels of intake for voucher termination. So all of these problems are working in concert to really squeeze voucher tenants. And I'll pass it to Deb to talk about some of our recommendations on that front.
Great, thanks. So our recommendations related to voucher tenants really focus on affordability, right? It shouldn't come as much of a surprise that, the results showed that a lot of voucher tenants were facing housing instability precisely because they're paying well over 30% of their income in rent. And so, we've also submitted a number of recommendations to HUD to make the program more affordable, including revising the way housing authorities calculate the income and therefore the tenants' rent. And also another example is when housing authorities are required to apply new payment standards to tenants. So along those lines, another resource that we published, I'm going to put when I'm done, I'll put in the chat the link to this other resource, but it's something we published with the Poverty and Race Research Action Council, PRAC, on increasing voucher payment standards. So HUD's provided some new flexibilities to housing authorities in setting their payment standards, which is the maximum rent. And so we wanted to get the word out that it's easier than ever for housing authorities to go up to and even above the normal payment standard amount, which is 120% FMR or small area FMR when setting their payment standards. And so I will put the resource in the chat, but I highly recommend that people working with tenants and or housing authorities, I'm really excited about this resource because it's very detailed and it tells you exactly under what policies housing authorities have this new flexibility. And I'll pass it back to Tanaya.
Okay, so across both the portfolios, voucher and public housing tenants, we asked about benefiting from emergency rental assistance. So For the PHAs, public housing tenants, 16% of our respondents reported seeing evictions from PHAs after they had accepted emergency rental assistance, and 19% reported seeing evictions from PHAs that refused emergency rental assistance altogether. This, if you've seen some of our previous surveys, you know that this was a pretty staggering data point in the private market. But you know, and these numbers appear relatively low at 16 and 19%, but you know, nearing a fifth of respondents seeing evictions from PHAs that refused emergency rental assistance is just like completely unacceptable when these numbers should really be 0%. And you'll see, you know, going back to that general market, 60% reported seeing evictions for voucher landlords after they accepted emergency rental assistance, and nearly 3/4 reported seeing evictions from voucher landlords that refused emergency rental assistance. So this is a trend that we saw across surveys, and it's very much alive and well. I just wanted to highlight one of the kind of behaviors that we saw across various states. And so I'll just read this quote from one of our HJNers in Montana, who said that voucher landlords collect rental assistance funds for a voucher tenant for months going forward and then evict the tenant, but refuse to return the ERA funds to the issuing agency or the tenant. And again, this is something that we saw time and time again in survey responses across various states. So while there were some places of, there were some examples that showed that policies against source of income discrimination and well-designed ERA policies really help to prevent this phenomenon. I'm thinking of places like New York and Oregon. The vast majority of states really responded that they're seeing this, particularly for voucher landlords. Okay, so now I just want to just comment briefly on the CARES Act. So next slide, please. And one more time. Thank you. Okay, so this again is something that we have been tracking throughout the pandemic about court enforcement of the CARES Act 30-day notice requirement for filing an eviction. This has been staggering in each of our surveys at each of the checkpoints throughout the pandemic. And for HUD-assisted tenants in particular, all of whom, you know, qualify for this protection, 88% of attorneys reported inconsistent or no court enforcement of this federal eviction notice requirement. Around 10% said that there was no court enforcement whatsoever in their area, and only 11% said that this was always enforced properly for their HUD-assisted tenants. And so that that is a really staggering number that I will pass back to Deb to discuss a bit.
Thanks. I'm just going to conclude with, and I'm going to underscore one of our overarching recommendations with all of this, which is the lack of available HUD data on evictions and housing instability. So one of the big takeaways from all of our surveys has been that, you know, it would be how great it would be for HUD to collect some of the data, its own data on participants. And my understanding is they're working towards that, but we really hope to see HUD take the necessary steps to collect this data on its residents, because it would just be immensely helpful for advocates and, you know, law and policymakers. So I think conclude with that, unless tonight you did anything else. Okay,
I'm good.
Well, Deborah and Tanaya, thank you so much. What an important research. I have to say it's somewhat depressing. So many of your findings about PHAs ignoring strategies to reduce rent and using the waivers, about, you know, huge increases in evictions with voucher housing due to rent unaffordability, and you know, you said you'd heard several times or multiple times about ERA, landlords collecting ERA, evicting anyway, and then not, you know, returning funds to the program or to the renter, and not following the 30-day notification period. So a lot of daunting stuff there, but really important recommendations. I just really want to thank you for this work and for all the work you guys do. We have a lot of comments and questions in the chat. Maybe I'll just pick one because there are way too many for me to sort through here. But there was a question here from Natalie Harris did you look at changes in who was accepted in public housing during COVID? And maybe that also refer to not just public housing, but you know, vouchers and so forth. Ours created a priority for homeless persons and housed over 300 in this priority, which could have resulted in greater eviction rates because they did not have adequate housing support. Any comment on that?
A great question. We did not look at it. You know, this survey was sort of the extent of our research capacity, but I know there are other researchers on the call right now who would perhaps be interested, but that's absolutely right. I mean, it could definitely impact, you know, if you're targeting certain populations in your voucher program, that could have an impact on any housing instability or eviction measure. But we don't have that data.
Great. I'll just share one other question that somebody had, which is a simple one. Would you be able to share contact information to reach out if we have other questions?
Absolutely. I'm not sure if it's in the slides, but I'll put my email in the chat. People should feel free to definitely reach out.
All right, very good. Thank you so much, Deborah and Tanaya, for this outstanding work. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, we will move on now to Elena Calabro, also from National Low Income Housing Coalition. Of course, you heard from her earlier in this call, and she's going to talk a little bit about from the perspective of our End Rental Arrears to Stop Evictions project, some new guidance from Treasury. So I'll turn it over to Elena.
Thanks, Paul. I'm happy to be back here. I'm just going to provide a brief overview of the recent changes that Treasury made to its ERA guidance. Next slide, please. Cool. So Treasury released updated guidance on the ERA 1 and ERA 2 programs on July 6th. The revised FAQ includes 3 new questions as well as revisions to 5 other questions. And it offers some additional information on duplicate payments, the documentation and eligibility requirements of when you're providing housing stability services without financial assistance, and some other provisions that I'm going to run through now. Next slide. So Treasury added a new FAQ to address what should happen if 2 grantees learn that they both provided rental or utility assistance to a same household that was intended to cover the same month's expenses. So Treasury says that in this instance, a grantee does not have to recover its payment, and instead it can recharacterize it as assistance covering a different period of eligible rent and utility expenses. Of course, they would have to document which expenses their funds ultimately covered, as well as confirm that the household was eligible for all of the assistance it received. Which would include ensuring that the total number of months of financial assistance received by the household did not exceed the statutory limits. So Treasury's new FAQ provides an example of this. So if a state and a local grantee both provided assistance to the same household to cover arrears from January and February, either grantee could recharacterize the assistance as covering arrears from March and April. If the grantee documents that the rental arrears ultimately covered those payments from March and April, and confirmed that the household would be eligible for assistance with respect to all 4 months of those arrears. Next slide, please. Treasury also added a new FAQ to say that grantees do not have the authority to augment the ERA eligibility requirements by conditioning assistance on a tenant's employment status, compliance with work requirements, or acceptance of employment counseling, job training, or any other employment services. Treasury stresses that while the statutes authorizing the programs, as well as its policy guidance, really do give grantees discretion in developing their programs, grantees are not allowed to impose additional eligibility criteria or require tenants to be employed, accept employment services, or comply with any work requirements. And then the final new question addresses whether landlords offered ERA are subject to source of income protection laws. Treasury basically says that this depends on the jurisdiction's laws. So depending on where you're at, and if there are state or local source of income protection laws, then yes, a landlord's refusal to accept ERA could violate one of those laws. Next slide, please. So Treasury revised questions 1 and 23 to address the documentation and eligibility requirements for households who are receiving housing stability services without any financial assistance. Treasury clarified that the ERA 2 statute does not restrict the provision of housing stability services to eligible households. And because of this, grantees are not required to document a household's eligibility if they're only providing the household with housing stability services and not financial assistance with ERA 2. That only applies to ERA 2 because the statute is different for ERA 2 versus ERA 1 in terms of who is eligible for housing stability services. So this is good. This will, facilitate the use of ERA 2 for these critical services such as legal aid, housing counseling, and other eviction prevention and diversion programs. Next slide, thanks. So Treasury also provided additional information on program accessibility for protected classes. They revised FAQ 15 to add that grantees must comply with Section 4 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which prohibits discrimination because of disability in programs or activities receiving federal financial assistance. Previous iterations of the guidance explicitly said that grantees must also comply with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, as well as the Fair Housing Act. And Treasury also revised question 37 to remind ERA grantees that they must ensure that they provide meaningful access to their limited English proficiency applicants and beneficiaries. Treasury also provided resources regarding these reasonable steps that grantees can take to provide meaningful access for these applicants. And I included a link to Treasury's promising practices on improving access for limited English proficiency persons on the slide. Next slide. So finally, Treasury provided some additional information on documentation requirements for bulk utility payments. In earlier guidance, Treasury had outlined the process for this, meaning that grantees could provide bulk payments to utility providers and landlords for multiple households based on reasonable estimates of the arrears before their application and documentation requirements were satisfied. This was to kind of like speed along these payments, but the grantees would have to collect all of that required documentation within 6 months. So in this version of the guidance, Treasury says that in the case of bulk utility payments, grantees may allow a utility provider up to 9 months from the time the bulk payment was made to satisfy those documentation requirements, but only if a utility shutoff moratorium was in effect in that grantee's jurisdiction for at least one of the 6 months following that payment. So yeah, the next slide, please. I think that those were all of the changes. I do have some resources here that I can also put in the chat. NLHC updated our ERA FAQ. Also, Treasury's guidance changelog is a really helpful resource when you're trying to track what has been going on with the guidance. And then we also have a memo article and a link to the FAQ. So I'll put all of those in the chat right now. And then I'm also happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Elena, for that very thorough description of the primary changes. There is a question here about these FAQs covering Treasury's ERA funds. Just curious, are you familiar with something similar for CARES Act funds?
That's a interesting question. So is there a specific pot of CARES Act funds? I'm wondering that Maria is asking about, and I can message you directly to see if there, because the CARES Act had so many different pots of funding for housing and homelessness. So I can follow up with Maria directly if that's helpful.
Great, and then Jerry commends the explanation of the FAQs. How might we enable a broader understanding of this new reality? Many more than NLIC advocates need to step up to inform those at risk and the larger public who should care. Any thoughts about that?
Thanks, Jerry. Yeah, that's a great point. we're also, I think, just really pushing. That's why the Eviction Crisis Act and the Stable Families Act is so critical, and why we're pushing that so hard right now, to create that permanent rental assistance program. And again, as always, it's a challenge when it shouldn't be to convince the public that we should be caring about the lowest income renters. But there are some really great bills out there that we're working on, and we appreciate your support as always for moving those forward.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much, Elena. Appreciate it. We will now move on to our field update. And we have with us Justin Schrick from the Vermont Affordable Housing Coalition. So Justin, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you so much, Paul, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Justin Sursick, and I'm a resident engagement AmeriCorps with the Vermont Affordable Housing Coalition, or VAHC. I'm here on behalf of our director, David Martins, who unfortunately fell ill and could not attend the call today. And I'm here to talk about a town hall program our coalition has organized in order to do outreach with candidates for state legislature. Currently, Vermont is in the middle of our election season for General Assembly, with the end of our biennial legislative session taking place this past May. What's unique, though, about this election is the historic number of legislators that are actually retiring from their posts, combined with the completion of our redistricting process, which has pitted some incumbents against each other and has opened up some other seats that incumbents normally held. When looking at retirements, around a third of the seats in each legislative chamber will no longer have incumbents running for re-election. And most of the chairs for the various housing, appropriations, and finance committees are also stepping down. This all means that it's an opportune time for VAHC to begin building relationships with candidates so that they can have informed discussions about housing during the primaries and general election, and so that we can hit the ground running in terms of advocacy with our new class of legislators in 2023. This is where our monthly town halls have come in. Divided by regions of the state, we have been inviting candidates, members of our coalition, and the members of the public to join a virtual meeting for candidates to hear current needs, past success stories, and to ask questions about state affordable housing programs and policies. Most importantly, we have been organizing these town halls in a way that does not endorse candidates, favor a party, or allow a stage for campaign stump speeches, which sometimes manage to get slipped in there just out of habit, but luckily to a lesser extent. Instead, candidates hear directly from their constituents about their housing needs rather than candidates talking down to their constituents. For each town hall, attendees register in advance and candidates for office submit questions on affordable housing issues so that we can guarantee members of our coalition who have larger stakes in those policy areas are able to attend and speak to those issues. For instance, if a candidate submits a question regarding supportive services funding, we can have someone from, say, that region's community action agency who's a part of our coalition come to speak to those issues. Or if it's a question about affordable homeownership programs and how to best fund those, we can bring on one of our housing nonprofits that runs that type of program and needs more funding, or a nonprofit that wants to start that type of program to talk about current and future needs. So far, the town halls have been rather well received, especially by the candidates from across the political spectrum, who all acknowledge that there's a lack of affordable housing in Vermont, and it's an important issue, even after historic ARPA investments into affordable housing here in Vermont. Our first event, which took place in June, garnered about 27 attendees, and we're having our next event at the end of the month, which 36 folks have registered for so far. So while this is an ongoing project, it's been really encouraging for us to see candidates not take this as a campaign opportunity for the most part, but to be able to speak with constituents and ask questions so that they can be able to better talk about these issues while on the campaign trail. It's also been great for us to make connections to and keep them ongoing so that we can work with these candidates once they become future office holders after the general election in 2023. So far, it's just been a really great process. And compared to last year, I think it's safe to say that the Affordable Housing Coalition here in Vermont feels a lot more well-prepared and connected for our advocacy work in the next year. And we can absolutely endorse early and frequent communications with office holders in order to get these important priorities done. So with that, that's about all I have to say. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Justin. And let me just say, first of all, that prior to the call, in getting ready for our call today, I asked Justin, how do I pronounce his last name? And then I went ahead and introduced him, and I mispronounced Sursic. So my apologies, Justin, on that. And
no worries, Paul.
I'll also just commend you for being in AmeriCorps Vista. A million years ago, I was the head of Vista training and support, so at the Corporation for National Community Service. So I admire the work that you do, and it does sound like you guys are doing really outstanding organizing work, mobilization work for the legislation you guys are working on. So kudos to you. Just out of curiosity, there's a question here from Jerry. If your Senator Sanders has responded to your campaign at all?
So this is mainly with state level candidates, though Senator Sanders' office has been great with working for our coalition, and he always has a representative on our monthly calls. But this has been a really great opportunity just to work at the out of the State House in Montpelier.
Fantastic. All right, I don't see any other questions here, Justin, except Gina said, can I get a Vista just like you here in Ohio? So you can follow up with her about that. But really appreciate it, Justin, appreciate the work that you're doing. We'll make sure that we get your name pronounced correctly in the future, and keep up the great work. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. So
that concludes today's call, and I just want to really encourage everybody. We will be sharing, number one, we will be sharing the recording of this session and all of the slides that have been presented. So you'll have that probably by tomorrow. We'll be sharing all of the many links that we've shared in the email that comes with that tomorrow. So many of you have been asking about, how do we get the links? How do we get the presentations, the PowerPoints and so forth? That will be coming out tomorrow. And we will be sharing with everybody this toolkit that you'll be able to use during August recess. Please be sure to reach out to your members of Congress and to utilize the resources in that toolkit to make a difference this summer. So thank you all for participating. Thank you to all of our panelists for their fantastic jobs. And we will see you next time. Take care, everybody. Bye.